What's up, you beautiful people? Welcome to the latest episode of Games Up podcast. My name is Cameron and I am joined by Lewis. Hello.
Hello there.
Hello there.
Hello. Awful.
You sound like you just welcomed me into your pub.
What you be having then?
Right then. Well, Lewis, how has your week been? Have you had a good week?
Yeah, it's been fun.
Good,
Been
good.
interesting.
Have you had an opportunity to play anything?
Yeah, I've been playing quite a lot of Horizon actually, because I got halfway through that game, left it, and then I come back to it and I'm like, oh, it's the best game ever. I forgot. The same thing happened with Witcher. I got halfway through, got bored of it, and then came back to it and realised.
They announced a complete edition for that today, didn't? Or not today, this week, I think.
Yes, they did. Which is interesting because it means it pretty much launches at the same time as the DLC for it.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I guess that's a clever way of bringing people in who didn't get there in the first place.
Yeah.
Seems like that might be, it seems like you probably want to hold that off for, February, though.
Yeah. But I'm alright. I think, it'll be a good deal when it comes out.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, the game was undeniably great.
Mm.
So, let's start, as we do every week, with the news. And we start this week with a bit of Overwatch Halloween news because it is October, which means it's the month of all spoops. And as a result, Overwatch is getting a little bit spoopy. We're going to have some Overwatch Halloween skins this month, along with the Halloween event, which has changed from Junkenstein's Revenge to a more generic Halloween name. So probably a bit of an expansion on the event like we saw with the Lucio event earlier this year. Some of the skins have leaked and they look cool. They are for May, Symmetra, Zenyatta, but I'd probably expect a few more come the time of the event because this week seems to be a bit small if it is the case. So keep your eyes peeled for Overwatch. It's being revealed the day after you hear this podcast if you're listening to it on the day it comes out, so the 10th. So tomorrow we're competing with the Star Wars trailer, yay us, and then the day after we're competing with Overwatch, so that's fun.
I'm loving the Cthulhu-styled skin.
Oh, which one's that? I haven't seen that one.
Well, you're going to tell me, yeah. Zenyatta?
Zenyatta? Oh, I didn't know that. Let me have a look at this. Zenyatta Halloween.
I believe.
Oh, I did not get that that's what that was. I thought it was just a sort of Kraken-y thing. That's awesome. Okay, that's really cool. So those are your Overwatch Halloween skins. Our next piece of news is the Shadow of War reviews are out. And whilst the overall opinion of the game is pretty positive, it's fair to say that the opinion on its free-to-play mechanics are not. And this is a pretty major trend this week, as it's been the case for a lot of games. The Star Wars Battlefront 2 beta raised a lot of questions in people's mind about the game's free-to-play loot box elements. It's also been announced that Assassin's Creed has loot boxes, and people got quite uppity about the Forza Motorsport VIP package, which was changed this time around to coincide more with a more traditional free-to-play style. That has been changed back, but all of this happened in a week where there was also a petition released that asked to limit the exposure that children have to loot boxes, as it is, to some people's mind, in a form gambling. Been a pretty heavy week for all this shit, Lewis. What's your take on it?
Yeah, so I don't really know, because Shadow of War is one of the ones that I'm really excited for on the one hand. I really love the first game, and I love what they've done with the story elements in this game. And it looks like that's something they're really trying to push heavy. But then, yeah, this other side of it, the microtransactions and the free-to-play element and the grinding, and I can see that reviews have come in, and that's something that they cite as a major downside, is that you can tell that stuff's kind of, while they haven't cut stuff away so much, you can get everything this way, but to actually acquire. To actually get access to this, you have to either grind loads or pay, and I don't really know what to do about that. That's going to be pretty major when I play it.
I think something that's worth bearing in mind is a lot of this, as with every kind of shitty situation anywhere, deserves a bit of context. So I think the Battlefront loot boxes are great. I've been playing the beta. I love the beta. Like I'm so in for this game. We'll talk about that more next week when we do our sort of big post EGX preview of everything coming out. But I was very skeptical going into the beta, and one of the reasons I'm in is because of loot boxes. I really like the way they've been handled, and they're also making the other content free. So like there won't be a season pass for Battlefront this time around, which is awesome. I'm totally into buy Battlefront 2 once and just keep having it updated. That is exactly the way I want my multiplayer stuff to be done. But I don't want that for Assassin's Creed. I think Assassin's Creed and the Shadow of War, and to some extent Forza as well, are mainly single-player experiences. Forza less so, but they should be to some extent limited by the scope of their story and the scope of what the game was at its core development. So I'm like less down with this for single-player stuff, totally down with this for multiplayer stuff.
Yeah, I mean, like my problem. I agree with you. They shouldn't ever really take any content out of single player stuff, in that way. But the thing is that like this is content that used to be free. You know, you have to think of it in that kind of context. You know, like this isn't stuff you used to have to pay for. Like you go back 10 years, you would get this for free. And I think in that context, I don't see it the same way you do.
I don't. Well, I again, context is important, right? Because like, I don't know that I agree for everything. I think it's okay that this stuff isn't free to some extent because video games are far bigger than they've ever been, and they employ far more people. And you know, if an opportunity came up for myself or yourself to work in games, we'd probably jump at it. And it's hard to aspire to an industry on one sense and then not pay for bits of it on another. And then with stuff like Overwatch, at this point, Overwatch is like over a year old, right? So the stuff that's coming out now a couple of years ago would have been bundled into like its first expansion pack, and you would have paid for. Like you would have got the Halloween stuff and maybe the Christmas stuff and maybe the Uprising stuff, the anniversary stuff, and then a bunch of the skins, and it would have been like pay £20 and here's the first expansion for it, like World of Warcraft, like those old Blizzard models. And that's not the case anymore. And it's because the people who are super hardcore Overwatch players and collect everything are willing to put money to be that. And I kind of think that's okay.
Yeah, but I don't think, in general, DLC and these items are equivalent to expansion packs. You know, like even so, you mentioned World of Warcraft, the original Battlefield series. I'm trying to think of good examples of things with expansion packs, but Dawn of War. Each of the expansion packs was like a major addition to the game, like completely changes the game, adds like the same amount of content as the base game. And we don't really see that these days with DLC anyway, let alone in any sort of games, any sort of multiplayer games.
Yeah, I can see that. I'd argue like that's kind of difficult for multiplayer because when Overwatch launched, it was maybe 40% of what it is now. Like
Okay.
there were a bunch, like there were less characters and less variety as a result. There's probably twice as many maps around that as when it launched. There were half the game modes. Like over time, there's been a fair amount of content added to that. And if you bundled it up all at once, as well as all the story stuff, all the way they've done the trailers, all the ARG stuff, like I think it's given Overwatch far more of a lifespan than it probably ever would have had. And it would have still had a lifespan, but not quite the ferocious lifespan it's had. And probably a really good example of this is stuff like Rocket League, where they do like quarterly expansions that are still fairly big. But that is funded by loot boxes. And I think the way Rocket League does loot boxes is like the worst of all the loot boxes. So it's like context, but I think it's worse by quite a margin in single player stuff.
Yeah, I suppose, but I'm just it's the price of entry for me. Like I would be so much more willing to agree with you if I came in with, I don't know, paying 30, 40 for Battlefront.
Okay, so here's the other question. would you pay 80 for Battlefront with all of this unlocked?
Well, no, because my basis is that I should be paying 60 for all of this unlocked, right?
But like, you can't have both. You can't have the shiny graphics and upgraded systems and the huge amount of depth that they've added to Battlefront 2 and still pay the same price as Battlefront 1. Like, if we expect games to expand and if we expect the medium to challenge itself, we do have to ask where we cover that cost, whether it's in time or patience or actual cost.
Yeah, but games get cheaper to make over time. Like they're not getting hyperbolically more expensive. But look, anyway.
No. This is like, this is the point of this. Like, okay, but games also in like the value of what they've cost when you deduct for inflation are cheaper as well.
Yeah, no, that is true.
And so, like, if the cost isn't, I think it's fair to say the cost is probably staying roughly the same because the games market is fairly stable. In that, even when it has peaks and dales, there's only been one major collapse in it, and that was nearly 40 years ago.
Mm.
So, like, I don't know. It's rare that you pay. Games have to make money somehow, and people call like the 80s and the 90s the golden age of video games. But if you watch stuff about what the developers had to do at that time, it was like the Wild West in that you could make a living and be the most amazing developer in the world, who was the best to their fans, and they put out games all the time and they were really good with extra content. But then equally, like, you could make nothing and be expected to do it from your bedroom. And like, with stability for the bottom end of that comes perhaps unfortunately stability for the top end. And maybe that's a good thing, maybe that's not. But it looks like loot boxes now, and it will look like something else in 5 years, right?
Yeah, I can agree with that.
It's a deep one.
I've heard that Battlefront 2 has certain very cheaty cards that you can get.
I haven't heard that. What have you heard?
Well, there was one that was like Boba Fett being invincible while in the air and things like that.
Wow, okay.
Just certain things that are like make it ridiculous.
I think I would hope, and I know it seems a bit silly to put my hope in EA, but I would hope that the beta is used to balance that stuff out. So, like, I think there's probably a couple of things that will change by the time they launch. I think certain powers will be less powerful, and I hope that cards become a bit more consumable, because I want loot boxes to have more value because of that consumable, but also because that then kind of depowers them. We'll talk about this next week really clearly, but I do really like the way it's handled it, and I think it fixes a lot of what was wrong with the last game.
Okay.
Next one, in a statement, Microsoft have commented on the state of VR, saying, "We don't want to distract developers with VR this year. We learned from Kinect." Ooh.
Well, yeah.
I don't... The first thing that worries me here is that when VR first came around, we did an episode years and years ago when we said, is VR and AR the future? And we were like, no, probably not. And I think it actually might be more than we thought it was.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, I don't necessarily think it's like in 3 years every game will be VR, but I think like it will be an additive technology. Like, you can still watch a DVD at home, but it's better in the cinema, right? So it might be something like you can still play a game at home, but it's better in a VR arcade or something like that.
Really? Okay.
I think it will be specialist.
Yeah, it will always be specialist. Well, so far. But I don't know, because the problem is that, like, the kind of VR that we're talking about doesn't... Like, you have to develop it differently. You can't just, like... It's not an easy transfer to make it a VR game. And that has problems, and I think like part of the problem that VR has at the moment is that Microsoft was super dedicated to VR back on the Xbox 360, right? Late, if you look at
360?
Not VR,
Motion controls.
motion controls. You look at how dedicated they were to motion controls, and how much that didn't really work out.
Yeah.
And I can understand why they wouldn't want to dive into VR for the same kind of reason.
So the reason we may split on this, I think, is because I would make the argument that the games that are made for VR couldn't be made for a traditional platform. Like, you couldn't really make Star Trek Bridge Crew, for example, for like a regular platform. And I think with motion control games, it was a case of like, here's a Fable game, but you can also play it with your hands. Whereas a VR game, it's got to be a very kind of active decision to be like, you can't play this any other way.
Yeah.
And so I think it may well become the future in that there will be a tipping point where it's either picked up or not, rather than motion controls or the jazz that came before motion controls or whatever the gimmick was, where it was like it kind of fizzled out under its own steam.
Yeah, I think the problem is that like no one's truly committing to it. That's kind of what I was trying to say with all of that. It's no one's really committing to VR. Like you can argue Bethesda are doing it, but they're also just kind of pumping out their old games in VR, and apparently it's kind of glitchy and doesn't really work that well, and they're not their main teams or anything like that.
Right. Okay.
So like, the only chance that VR really has to take off is for like Bethesda to go, our next game is VR only, and it's the next Skyrim, no, the next Elder Scrolls is VR only. We've made it this way, built it from the ground up, but no one's going to do that. And until that time comes, VR's not going to take off in the same in the big kind of way.
Yeah, I agree with that. That's a really fair statement. Yeah. All right, time for a much lighter piece of news now. For you Pokemon Go players, that's right, all 5 of you, of which I'm still one, so I can make the joke. Generation 3 may be coming around at the end of this month. There's been a couple of forced updates recently, and they don't really tend to force updates unless there's something you need. So like when the raids came out, they forced updates so that everyone was on the same playing field. They've done it recently for a couple of updates, and people have mined into it and found a bunch of the stuff for Gen 3. That's usually a really good sign that it's like a couple of weeks, if not a little more than a month away. Check out the Sylph Road. They do a much better job at explaining all of this than me. But also, hoard some coins, hoard some bag space. You may well need it in a couple of weeks.
For the infinite number of Pokemon that is coming.
I know this. I know it sounds silly, but I am so fucking excited for that.
Doesn't it? Unless things have changed since I played it, don't you have to combine Pokemon? So, like, if there's another 200 Pokemon or something, then it's going to be harder to upgrade your Pokemon.
How do you mean?
Because, like, maybe I'm from the past and it's different now, but you needed to catch, like, 2 Zubats to get a better Zubat.
So you had to catch...
Oh, wait, you had to catch one and then
you had to
turn it into juice.
Yeah, you had to catch enough to get the candies to evolve it.
Yeah.
And that is the case. But that's kind of what the inherent value of this is. Like, so the starters, or the Rattatas and Pidgeys or whatever, you'll find all the time. But the stuff that's rare, you will look for the year until the next gen comes out. It's kind of really well balanced in that sense.
Okay. I'll take your word for it.
I was going to say, sometime come back to Birmingham sometime. We'll go on like a midnight walk. It'll be fun.
Yeah.
2 more pieces of news to go. Neither of them particularly good, so let's jump into one of them. The people behind Pubbage, or PUBG, or PUBG, or however you say it, I prefer Pubbage, are in talks with Sony about a PS4 version, apparently, which means that this is yet another notch in the terrible exclusivity trend this year. This is exhausting. But this week they also said that Microsoft might be in talks for further exclusivity. So simultaneously, a brand is saying to you, it will only be available on this one thing, but it won't, but it might be. So you take from that what you will. I think this is shitty to consumers. I'm so excited for Pubbage on Xbox One. I cannot fucking wait. That's like a day one purchase for me. I'm super excited for it. But this is one of the things that's like, I don't want to support this shit because you shouldn't be having to live. You shouldn't be having to like hold back on a decision to purchase something because the company's being mysterious. And it's happened on a fair amount of games this year, and it may still be happening on some of them. Like, we don't know what the deal is with Crash. We don't know what the deal is with certain indie games. Like, this isn't on anymore.
Yeah, and there's a lot of speaking on those lines. There's a lot of PS4 games that are coming to PC. Some of the ones that were like third party that were on PS4 just because that's the only console that the Japanese were interested in.
Yeah.
But some of these games are now coming to PC, and I wonder whether they'll get kind of if there's a way for Microsoft to get like easily onto the Xbox nowadays from there.
Like, so what you're saying is like, so there was a thing talked about this week that I think it's Neo. It's one of the two. I think it's Neo.
Yeah, Neo
is having a port to the PC, but not to the Xbox.
Yeah,
but they haven't said it's not coming to the Xbox. They've just said it's only like. I get that to some extent this is something companies can't control. Like, they're obviously not going to say we're not bringing it to the Wii, right? Because that's stupid. But for something like Pubbage, where they're specifically avoiding what it is coming to, that's different. And Crash is the same. And I know I've gone on about Crash a bunch, but like, there is no sign that you can trust about whether you should buy it on one place or wait for another. And every time that it looks like it's more certain, like the last 6 weeks, there's not really been much discussion about Crash at all. It seems fair to say at this point it probably looks more like an exclusive, right?
Yeah.
Except that game exclusivity typically runs for a third party for like 3 to 4 months, which means June, August, September, October. If we were to hear about it, it would probably be near the end of this month, which means there's still like 3 weeks of this could mean anything.
Yeah, I think, but there hasn't been many games that have been had different release dates for Xbox and PlayStation. Like I think a good example is Tomb Raider, but then I don't think there was actually that many. I don't think there's that many in the list that were like exclusive on one and then the other, and then came to the other. So I don't know if this is something that's like actively done.
I don't know, like Tomb Raider.
Yeah, but that's like the example.
I know, but like, so it might not be, it might not be like full games though. So like DLC is terrible for it.
Yeah.
Did you see the shit with Destiny this week, where it's like some of the content that launched exclusively with PlayStation for Destiny 1 has just now become available on Xbox? What the fuck? Who is that good for? Like, and this is what's baffling about it is it's not good for Activision because, like, if they were going to make the money on PlayStation, they've probably done it by this point because they released a totally different game. It's not good for Xbox for obvious reasons, but it's not good for those consumers because neither of them knew. The only people who benefit are Sony, and Sony aren't really going to benefit because nobody's picking up a console for DLC.
Yeah.
Like, it's one of those weird, shitty holdovers from a couple of generations, from last generation, where the fight was so strongly games. The generations before it, hardware was the thing that sold it, right? Like, you've got the whole Sega with blast processing, and then, to some extent, the PlayStation and the GameCube were so vastly different that hardware was selling it. It's a weird holdover from last generation, but it needs to stop.
Yeah.
But the topic of discussion that's going to be super heavy this week is Wolfenstein. Wolfenstein: The New Colossus released a trailer and a bit of a social campaign this week with the social tag "Make America Nazi Free Again," and the responses were grim.
Yeah.
A lot of people came out saying that this was, rather than a clever social campaign, that it was a political statement of Wolfenstein's political alignment, and that they were aligning themselves with leftism, aligning themselves with SJWs, blah, 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 that kind of nasty internet shit. I think, to some extent, Wolfenstein kind of brought this upon itself, because what a world we live in where we can say the discussion of the word Nazi has been quite popular this year. Oh, fuck. It's a word that's been used a lot more, and the context of which has been discussed a lot more, quite worryingly so. But they would have known this, and they released this for a reason. They could have gone. There's lots of other social campaigns that could have worked for them. They chose this for a reason, and it was very, very clever. But in my opinion, and Lewis, I'll defer to you in a second. In my opinion, if you're looking at a video game trailer that's based around a hypothetical World War II scenario and saying, "You fuckers need to keep your voice out of politics today," you might need to look at yourself, because that screams Nazi sympathizer to me. And perhaps that's a very strong term to put it, but it worries me that we live in a world where a video game trailer can be considered a political statement, not because of the video game trailer, but because of the people it's purportedly angering.
Yeah. So I followed this story quite a lot on Reddit, where there was some very mixed responses. It's like disturbingly, like a disturbing number of downvotes on it. Yeah, it's very strange, because like we're kind of removed from most of that being over here in the UK.
Yeah.
I mean, we're removed from like the Trump side of it.
Like there's nobody in London with tiki torches, but it's closer than I'd like.
Yeah. But yeah, like the fact that in this day and age, like the Wolfenstein's being considered like a political statement by coming out and saying no more Nazis, is strange.
It is.
I admit that you're right. You're right in a way that the wording did kind of bring it on themselves.
I mean, I don't think they brought it on themselves, because that would suggest that they went out of the way to anger alt-right, which is weird. But I think they very cleverly, fuck me. I think they very cleverly chose the message they were going with, and they did it to
get as much attention.
Yeah, they did it to promote tension off the back of political tension.
I mean, in that kind of sense, yeah. Like if there was such a decisive slogan during the American election, the whole "Make America Great Again," and they've taken that, like they knew at least it would piss off like half of America. So I mean,
but yeah, like it's they did it clearly for a reason, and they did it to get attention off the back of political tensions. It's just very worrying that we live in a time where the word Nazi once again means political tension.
Yeah. No, you're not wrong.
So this week was a real heavy week of news. So let's move on to a considerably lighter topic. You may have noticed this week, mainly because we'll promote it as such, that we're in episode 69. Hey. So So the topic of the week this week is video games and romance. That can mean a lot of things, but I think we should talk about how I think romance has become something in games that's taken a lot of steps forward in the last few years. For a while, video games were sold mainly as action or horror or genre things, and they've taken a step forward in the last few years in that there are much more games defying genre to tell more human stories, whether that be through walking simulators, for example, which have taken a totally different approach to how you make video games, or whether that be a video game that takes traditional game mechanics but tells a slightly different video game story, like, ironically, the first Wolfenstein or Dishonored, for example.
Yeah.
So, Lewis, what do you think... this is a weird question to ask, but what do you think the state of romance is in video games?
Well, I agree with you on some level. Like, it's gotten easier nowadays to kind of have romance in games. It's still not very highly featured, but um, you know, there was a point in time when it was almost impossible because of the graphics or because of the ability to have the situation. And it has been progressively getting better, but as I say, it's not very highly featured. There isn't many games that kind of deal with romance in a good way, or have like a realistic romance, I guess is the way to look at it. Like if you look at something like Fallout, where the characters just fall on you, that's not really a good example of romance in video games. I don't think anyone would quote the amazing love story between Shepard and Liara. So it's possible now. It's definitely possible, but it's not very much done.
I think it's weird to say that gaming has matured, right? Because that would suggest at some point that gaming was immature. But I think gaming has presented a more mature face. I think that always existed. It just didn't necessarily sell it. Like video games were very much sold to one type of consumer. And that meant selling in the way that consumer stereotypically tends to like. Whereas I think over the last few years, with a real push for video games to be considered more than just the thing that wants to like kill your children. So people like Jeff Keighley making the Video Game Awards, which is as praising of something like Call of Duty or Borderlands as it is Emily is Away or Siebel or Walking Simulators or indie games. And I think it's really nice that we're at a time now where you can have something like Dishonored, where you can play a super hardcore stealthy game if you want, or you can take real time to consider the characters and their motivations and their stories if you want. And it's what you want to get out of it that makes a difference. Video games are weird in that they're an active medium. If you watch a movie, whatever is in that movie is what you will get out of it, assuming you are willing to take that from it. Whereas video games, like, there's maybe sometimes 20, 30, 40 paths you can take, and it's really what your interest is going in that comes out with the story you want to get. Telltale are a great example of this.
Yeah, okay. Telltale are a great example, actually. I hadn't considered those. So, do we want to talk about games that do it well?
That is a good idea. That is a very good idea. Have you got any on the top of your head?
A few.
Okay.
So, I don't know of your experience with them, but so there's the game The Darkness, which I think is actually quite a good example.
That's really interesting. I've played the first 2 hours of The Darkness, and I didn't get that.
Okay, so I think it's one that sticks with me because The Darkness, it approaches the kind of like the stereotypical save the girl storyline, but does it in a very much like you're the victim kind of way, in like a. Like, it's what makes the main character become dark. It's what makes his evil come out. And I think, like, it ends, I believe it's the end. But there's, like, it brings you back to, like, romantic moments to try and, like, bring the main character back to being normal again. That's kind of the whole focus is, like, trying to avoid becoming this evil entity. And I think, like, the character's interactions with his partner is really actually quite deep for a game that came out that long ago. I don't think games were too good with relationships at that time, and I think it's probably a positive for me. It's one that I remember anyway. Do you want to go back and forth?
Yeah, sure. I'll go with the one that will make you roll your eyes on this one, but but I'll present it in a way that's fresh, perhaps. The two I want to put forward sort of as one are Emily is Away and Gone Home. I love Gone Home because Gone Home is set in the 80s. It's set in the Midwest of America. I think it's like rural America. And so it's set in a time that I don't have any kind of understanding of, other than like through media. I didn't live through it, so I've got no context for it. Whereas Emily is Away is set in kind of 2000s-ish, and it's set in an online platform. So in Emily is Away, you are using like AIM or MSN, or a kind of version of that, to chat to people and develop friendships and relationships with them. And in Gone Home, you follow the story of a young girl who returns to her empty house to find that her parents have fled to go after her sister, who's chasing a romantic relationship. And Emily is Away made me really like cringily nostalgic, because in the way that like your dialogue options and stuff are that you can be a cringy online nerd or not. And it's very weird to be taken back to that kind of place where a lot of the way we interacted with people when we were young teenagers was through MSN, was through like chat windows, was through online dialogue. And to actually have that presented as a game where you're achieving something really makes you understand how much we kind of achieved through platforms like that. And then in the same way, Gone Home made me consider how stuff like mixtapes and zines and stuff like that was like early 90s, late 80s, actually did much the same, just for a different generation. It's nice that through romantic stories, I've kind of gained an understanding and hopefully a respect for the context of a couple of different generations, including my own.
Yeah, well, seems very good. I'll be honest, I'm not a big fan of, I guess, explore. I like Emily is Away, but I'm not a big fan of kind of exploring story in like walking games. So it kind of takes me away from it a little bit.
So what do you like in a walking game?
Oh no, it's not that. It's just like I don't generally
like walking games.
Yeah, like that's the problem is that it always tends to be like you interacting with the world after something's happened, or like you can only see it if you like.
Yeah, I get that.
Like you see the effects of it, you don't, or you read or you look at the things that have happened, but you don't really get to like interact. You don't get to kind of feel like, I don't know.
You're totally disconnected from the situation.
Yeah, like I wouldn't say totally, but it's just that like your character's kind of like separate from the world. Generally.
I get that.
Yeah. Okay, so
all right, you'll go.
So I'm going to mention the Uncharted series, Drake and Elena. The big thing with this one, and the big reason why it's worth a mention, is that it really develops throughout all four games. It's not like like the goal of a game is to get with the girl, or or it's just something that happens and everyone's in love with him straight away. It's like it's a real big thing that develops throughout the games. Especially in the fourth one, because I mean the fourth one's all about him deciding to go out again or settle down, and I think like Naughty Dog are always really good with relationships and having them like really good writing in relationships. They did it with Last of Us, obviously not romantic, but it's still kind of very deep relationships they try and form. And I think their relationship in Uncharted is a really good example of this. The way that like they make characters have chemistry together, and like how Drake isn't this like one-dimensional character who's always an action hero. Especially when he meets up with Elena and he has to kind of put his tail between his legs and go, "I'm sorry for running away," to go on adventures. Yeah,
I think, if you don't mind me jumping off that point, the next one I was going to put forward was Telltale's Batman.
Okay.
Mainly the reason for this is because Batman, like, being a big Batman fan, it's the Telltale game that I read the most into, so like it's the one I was the most invested in when I played it. The Walking Dead comes like second, but that's for different reasons. And the reason I like it is because having a relationship with a character is not just like gold star, you got the sex achievement. It's like there's actual implications to it. Like if you lie, if you lie to a character, they might find out about it, and you might have to deal with the fallout of that. If you communicate properly, it still might not work the way you intend it to. Relationships are messy, and they don't always work, and they don't always get fixed, and they certainly don't always just happen. Like, you have to put work into that, and I think Telltale are like the masters of kicking you in the stomach, because they're really good at setting you up with something where you have an intention, and everything can go your way, and something beyond your control will change that. And like, much like life and relationships, really, a Telltale game is great because you learn how to deal with the fallout of what you do and how to turn that into something good, rather than like how to go in with the best plan and come out successful. So like, I think Telltale do a really good job of using real relationships to tell stories, and some of those are friend relationships, some of those are romantic relationships, but they have that kind of real world implication and context, which is great.
Yeah, I'd completely go along with that. I love the Telltale games just for their story, and definitely how they build these kind of big relationships with characters that are kind of deep. And there's all that thing of like, whenever you do an action, it's like that person will remember it, and it actually does like affect stuff down the line. I think it's really, I was talking earlier about like not feeling like you're interacting with the characters. I think Telltale's a really good one for actually, yes, you can interact with the characters and make differences to what they say.
Yeah.
Subtle or otherwise, but it's good.
It's very, very good. And if you haven't played a Telltale game, like, if for some reason you've clicked onto this show and you're not into games and you've got through the news, firstly, thank you, Christ. Secondly, like, please give a Telltale game a go, because it's probably the least like a video game thing you'll ever play. And it's equally it's something that might hopefully be able to show you how far video games have come, because a Batman game can either be the Arkham games, where it's like beating things up and being a more traditional video game, or they can be a Telltale game where you're like lying to politicians or having to conduct yourself as a philanthropist. And it is genuinely one of the most mature games and series and approaches to video games I've played in a while.
So,
have ye a final one?
Yes. So I'm gonna bring in the archetypal game that you mention in any games list to win, which is Witcher 3. So, but it's actually Witcher series. So, and specifically, well, I'm gonna go with Triss and Geralt. So the thing is that The Witcher is a really well-written series, and if you pick up the third one, you'll get the feeling from that. But what you maybe won't realize is that there's kind of these two games before that build up everything. Mm-hmm. And the general story of Geralt is that he lost his memory, and then at one point he gains it back, and he loses his memory, and he gets in a relationship with somebody, and then eventually he gets his memory back and finds out that actually he had this old relationship with somebody else. And then in The Witcher 3, that kind of comes head to head during the game. And the interactions there are really interesting, but also it's an approach to a different type of relationship, because while you tend to have straight relationships and homosexual relationships these days, you don't tend to have like open relationships in the same kind of way, unless you're playing something along the lines of Fallout and you can just mate with everyone.
Yeah.
So like Witcher 3 actually has the potential to have an open relationship, which I think is kind of interesting. And like Geralt and Triss have for a long time been friends with benefits throughout the whole series.
Right.
And I think that's like, in Witcher 3 you try and kind of bring that to an end. You try and like settle down together, but it's strange because neither of you's like, you're both kind of action heroes. Like the whole thing with Geralt is while he's a deep character, at the same time he's also like really the stereotypical like James Bond kind of, literally anybody will sleep with me and I'm amazing and can destroy everything, but the thing that they do is that they bring in these other characters that manage to humanize him, and like that's why I kind of like the relationship. You have his ending story as being like, I'm settling down and everything's kind of just going to be a normal guy from now on. With a partner if you haven't screwed up, because you can screw up. You can screw up, and it's one of the best like cutscenes ever. But yeah, like as long as you make whoever you decide to be happy, and it's got this real depth to it. I think is really what I'm trying to say. And like it's got more depth than most games have because it's been built along this series.
Mm. It's like it's taken time.
Yeah, but that's the same thing with Uncharted, you know, like the fact that this relationship takes time, it's not something that you just kind of get, you know. I feel like I'm ripping on Fallout and probably Mass Effect as well, but you know, they're games where
you
talk to
bastard.
that
I was going to
character
rip
5
on
times.
Mass Effect next.
You're gonna promote Mass Effect?
No,
or-
I was gonna kind of promote it, kind of rip on it.
Okay. Oh, it suffers as well.
Like, so Mass Effect is like the go-to when it goes to talking about romance in video games, and like Mass Effect Andromeda was, I think, a really big step forward, because Mass Effect Andromeda was like finally not afraid to show sex, which is nice because like it's a very weird disjointed thing that you play games where like you rip people's heads off and you blow things apart and you can destroy entire buildings with your bare hands, but like the second you meet a nice man or a nice lady, you go behind a curtain and nothing can be seen. It's very weirdly protective of its own audience, which like doesn't make any sense, because if you're big enough and aware enough to like be Gears of War and kind of commit genocide, you're probably okay to see a pair of breasts. Like it's a weird maturity balance. And what I liked about Mass Effect, it was that it showed sex and it made it look sexy, but it didn't ever go like too porny. It wasn't ever too grotesque or too exploitative of the virtual characters and their stories. But the problem I have with Mass Effect is that Mass Effect is like, to some extent, it's kind of not promoted, but it's gained a reputation for being this kind of playground of, you can meet these alien races and you can save them or kill them or fuck them. And it's a weird, like, it's weird that Mass Effect is kind of like the Star Wars of games, like, or it was at least. Like, no game had ever told a story on that scale and invented these races and these backgrounds and these deep histories on that scale. But then at the same time, it was like you could kind of have sex with them as just an added bonus. Like in a way, it kind of devalued it. Undeniably, it kind of devalued it. The game I'm gonna say is my final is a total curveball, I think, and it's LA Noire.
Okay, didn't expect that. That is a curveball.
Like,
explain yourself.
I will do. I damn well will. LA Noire is lovely for a couple of reasons, because to get anything out of it, you have to be willing to read into people's relationships and make some pretty big assumptions that might turn out not to be right. Like, when you accuse somebody of doing something, you have to be pretty sure that you're making that accusation right, and half the time you'll get it wrong. Like, the game is quite good at hiding facts from you. But there's a big... And if you haven't played LA Noire again and you've somehow managed to get through the news and you're not a gamer, that's like one of the second things I would suggest you pick up. I think it's a really cool approach to video games. I'm going to spoil it very briefly here, so skip over a minute of this. There's a moment about 2/3 into LA Noire where the lead character, Cole, gets kicked out of his house. And your wife like uncovers that you're cheating and actually you're a really bad guy. Like, you don't treat your family well at all. And the reason I really like LA Noire as a thing of relationships is because you spend the entire game researching how healthy or unhealthy other people are, but you have no look into how healthy you are as a person. And it's a really nice way of making you take stock of what you perceive to be good, what you perceive to be healthy and unhealthy, and how you balance that kind of stuff. Like, when that moment happens, Cole goes from being like the good guy cop in blue to like, oh, you're actually just good at a job. Like that's kind of it. The bit we're playing of you is all you're good at, and it makes it a much more human experience because you still take part in cases after that. You still accuse people based on their relationships, but you feel a lot more hollow doing it as the actual player because you're aware that you're making these accusations against people where you've moved a story forward where you've done a similar thing. Probably not the murdery part, but like you've been equally deceptive. And it was really nice because L.A. Noire was not sold as a story of relationships. It wasn't sold as a story of family. It was sold as like the ultimate noir experience. But the ultimate noir experience has to have some kind of discussion about a flawed hero and a flawed character and what it is to be flawed. And I like that it was willing to throw that curveball at you. And I kind of wish more games did that.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. So that you're saying the romance is good here because it's not good. It's because it's... Yeah.
It's not afraid to make you kind of probe into them and then be surprised by probing into yourself. And that's a really important thing to do. Like, as any kind of person, being willing to have a little bit of internal dialogue about who you are and how you conduct yourself and what you do and how you can change or not change is a very healthy thing to do. And games don't often do that. Like, often games... the most you do that is like an upgrade tree where you get better at punching things. Actually, having a game that through its story said, you need to look in the mirror before you attack this criminal was a very, very weird and I think quite a healthy thing. And I kind of wish it got talked about more.
Yeah.
So I have a final question on you as we wrap this up, if that's all right.
Okay. Do
you think that gaming is going to get better with the way that it talks about and presents romance?
Yeah, I think so. I think we're seeing quite a lot more story games, I think, and we're seeing games that take story more seriously.
I'd agree.
At least on PlayStation. But well, I think we're seeing quite a divergence actually. So we're seeing like single player games are starting to become more and more story games.
Mm-hmm.
Multiplayer's going off and doing its own thing, but I think single player specifically is becoming more and more about story as opposed to like just action or just whatever adventure. You know, if you look at a lot of the games that have released in the last few years, then some of the biggest ones are games that focus on story. So yeah, I think we'll go there.
Yeah, I would agree. I think we still have a way to go in that the voices that gaming has are changing, and rightfully so. And with new people talking about new stories comes new perspectives, and they will take time to ingratiate into gaming and like they'll become more part of the mainstay culture, but, you know, it will take time. But what's nice about that is that gaming does need to be challenged, just like every media and medium needs to be challenged. And I think gaming is going to get more comfortable with talking about adult stories, not adult like XXX, but like adult as in midlife crisis 40, 50-year-old stories, because it's not afraid. Because like there are now generations and generations of adults who played games and still are very comfortable with them, and so there will be stories that relate to those people and that come from those people, and so I think it's good that the voices that gaming is bringing on gets broader, and as a result we get less afraid to talk about stuff that is sometimes scary to talk about, like relationships or sex, rather than just guns, and guns.
Yeah, definitely. And I look forward to kind of seeing more and more, because like recently, as I say, there's been more of it, and I'm all about story, or good story in video games, so you know, all the better.
Yeah, I agree. I definitely agree. So let's wrap this up here. What a very nice discussion we had there.
Very nice.
And thank you very much for joining this discussion. If you did, we really hope that we gave you some fresh perspectives on stuff there, because this is the kind of discussion I hope that doesn't happen as much for gaming, and I hope that in doing it a little bit, we help make it a little bit more popular, even if we're tiny, which we are. Thank you very much for joining me, Lewis.
Yeah, glad to be here. Glad to talk.
It's been a pleasure. And please, everyone else, join us next week when the week before all the big games come out, we are going to go through our thoughts on all the big games. So we have thoughts for you on Assassin's Creed. We have thoughts for you on Far Cry, Pubbage. We have thoughts for you on Star Wars Battlefront and far, far more. We're going to run down what we think of how 2017 looks for the end of the year in our big, big wrap-up. So join us for that next week, Monday at 6:30 on YouTube, and much earlier that day on iTunes, so you can get it on your way to work. You can subscribe on both of those platforms so you don't miss it. And if you do like this, please feel free to like the show. It gets us out in front of a few more people, and we know that you like it, which keeps us going. Thanks very much. See you next week. But until then, the game's up.